The call came at 11:47 p.m. Not from a blocked number. Not from one of his men. From the Seoul Corporate Registry Office, a government line so mundane, so ordinary, that Moon-yeon almost didn't answer it. He was mid-signature. A 4.7 trillion Korean won's merger. 43 floors above the Han River. His pen was already moving across the final page when his personal phone vibrated against the glass table, rattling softly like a warning he chose to ignore. He answered on instinct. Power always does. Mr. Moon-yeon. This is the Seoul Corporate Registry. We are calling to notify you that effective as of midnight tonight, a Clause 14B transfer, filed 18 months ago in your divorce settlement, has been formally activated. As of 12 a.m., you are no longer the registered owner of Moon-yeon Holdings. The pen stopped. The room didn't. Lawyers kept shuffling papers. His CFO adjusted his glasses. The merger partners across the table exchanged pleasantries in quiet Japanese. The entire machine of his empire kept moving, completely unaware that the man at the head of the table had just been erased from it. Yun set the phone face down on the table. He pressed his palm flat against the cold glass surface and, for the first time in 11 years, calculated something he could not win. People who had never met Moon-yeon assumed he was simply ruthless. They were half right. Ruthlessness was the coat he wore. Underneath it was something far more dangerous: precision. Every company he absorbed, every rival he dismantled, every courtroom verdict that somehow tilted in his favor, none of it was luck. It was architecture. Yun built his world the way he built his empire. Cold, clean, and without a single door he hadn't personally locked. His penthouse office on the 43rd floor of the Moon-yeon Tower reflected that. No family photographs. No sentimental objects. Just a single black orchid on the windowsill, alive, immaculate, and completely alone, and floor-to-ceiling glass that turned Seoul into something that looked manageable. Small. His. He had divorced Han Sui on a Tuesday. He remembered the date not because it hurt him, but because he had scheduled it between a board meeting and a quarterly review. Efficient. Clean. Necessary, or so he told himself. What he had not done, in his architectural precision, was read every line of the document his own lawyers placed in front of him. Specifically, Clause 14B, Article 7. Paragraph 3. In the event that the party of the first part engages in any activity flagged under the Korean Financial Crimes Act within 24 months of the dissolution of this marriage, all primary shareholding rights, totaling 61% of Moon-yeon Holdings, shall transfer unconditionally to the party of the second part. Han Sui, his ex-wife, the woman he had considered, in his arrogance, too gentle to fight him. He had been flagged 14 months ago. A ghost transaction. Old Mafia money moving through a route he thought he'd buried. He hadn't even known it happened. But the paperwork had. And Sui's lawyers, quiet, thorough, invisible, had been watching the clock ever since. The call tonight wasn't a surprise attack. It was a checkmate delivered in real time. And she had waited until the exact moment he was signing the biggest deal of his career to let the clock run out. Yun finally lifted his eyes from the table. Across the room, his assistant was already standing, pale, rigid, holding a second phone with both hands like it might burn him. "Sir," he said, barely above a whisper. "There is a car downstairs. It's not ours." Yun straightened his cuffs. Slow. Deliberate. The death stare settling back into place like armor being locked. He picked up his pen. He finished the signature. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and said, quietly, to no one and everyone, "Tell them I'll be down in 3 minutes." Because Moon-yeon did not run. Not from syndicate rivals, not from prosecutors, and not from the woman who had just legally dismantled everything he built. But as the elevator doors closed behind him and Seoul's rain-slicked skyline blurred in the glass, cold blue light fracturing across his face like a city quietly celebrating, he felt something he had not felt since the night his father handed him a gun at 17 years old and told him the world only respected one language. Fear. Not of Sui. Of the version of himself she was about to force him to become. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The 3 minutes he promised himself were the last 3 minutes he would ever spend as the undisputed king of that building. When the elevator opened into the lobby, 2 men in charcoal suits were waiting, not his men. Their posture was too clean, too legal. Corporate security. The kind hired specifically to escort someone out without creating a scene. Jan recognized the firm immediately. He had used them himself, twice, to remove board members who thought sentiment would protect them. He almost laughed. He walked ahead of them without being asked. Through the marble lobby where 3 junior analysts froze mid-conversation at the sight of him. Past the front desk where the night receptionist stared at her screen with the focused intensity of someone pretending not to witness something historic. Through the revolving glass doors and into the rain-cold Seoul air, where a black company car, his company car, with his plates, sat idling at the curb, now apparently assigned to ferry him away from his own address. He stood on the pavement for exactly 4 seconds. Long enough to understand what Clause 14b had actually been. Not a punishment. Not even a trap, in the traditional sense. It was a sleeper, buried so deep in the divorce architecture that even his own legal team had filed it away as a theoretical risk. Something that would only activate under a specific, unlikely chain of events. Sui had simply been patient enough to wait for the chain. He got into the car. Alone. And as it pulled into the stream of Seoul's midnight traffic, Moon Yun stared at the tower receding in the rear window, his name still lit in white letters 43 floors above the street, and understood, with the clarity that only total loss produces, that he had been outplayed by the one person he had never taken seriously enough to study. She arrived at 7:15 the following morning. Yun knew because he was already there, sitting in the building's second-floor conference room, a room he had never once used, because men like him did not hold meetings on the second floor, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and his lawyer on the phone saying words like limited options, and we could contest the activation timeline in the careful tone of someone who already knew they had lost. He heard the lobby before he saw it change. A different kind of quiet settled over the building. The specific hush that falls over space when genuine authority walks into it. Not the fearful silence his presence produced. Something more considered. More voluntary. Han Sui stepped out of the elevator at 7:22. Cream blazer. Minimal gold at her ears. Hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had not dressed for him, or for the cameras, or for the moment, but simply for the work. She carried a single leather portfolio and nothing else, and she crossed the lobby with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had been mentally running this company for longer than the paperwork officially allowed. Their eyes met through the conference room glass. She didn't smile. Neither did he. She came in, set her portfolio on the table, and sat down across from him, close enough that the distance between them felt deliberate. Architectural. The same way everything about their marriage had been deliberate, and then deliberately destroyed. "You stayed," she said. "I built this place," he said. "I wasn't going to disappear before you explained yourself." She looked at him for a moment, that expression he remembered from their marriage, the one that always preceded her saying something he wasn't ready to hear. Sadness layered under resolve, like a surgeon who genuinely wished the operation wasn't necessary. "I'm giving you a choice," she said. "Stay. Director of Security and Special Operations. Full salary, full access to the building, full ability to protect everything you built from the people who are currently trying to dismantle it from the inside." She paused. "Or leave. And watch what your old associates do to this company once they realize there's no one here who speaks their language." He studied her face for the thing he was looking for, triumph, satisfaction, the quiet gloat of a woman who had won. He found none of it. What he found instead was worse. She was tired. Not of him, specifically. Of the entire machinery that had made him who he was and cost her who she used to be. "You'd trust me here?" he asked. "After everything?" "I don't trust you," she said, with a precision that was almost kind. "But I know you. And right now, that's more valuable." He picked up the cold coffee. Drank it. Set it down. "Where's my office?" He discovered this at 9 a.m., when his assistant, his former assistant, technically now Sui's, though the young man had the grace to look genuinely pained about it, led him down a corridor he had walked past 1,000 times without ever registering. The office was not small. That would have been easier. It was precisely mid-level, a desk, 2 chairs, a window that faced the interior atrium rather than the Seoul skyline, and walls thin enough that he could hear the sales team's morning briefing from the adjacent room. He sat at the desk. He was still sitting there, motionless, when he heard a knock at the open door and looked up to find 2 of the junior logistics analysts hovering in the hallway, stopping short the moment they realized the man behind that desk was him. They both took an involuntary step backward. Yun watched it happen with the detached clarity of someone finally reading a document they had been avoiding. He had always known his employees respected him. He had taken that as a given, the way a king takes the silence of a room as appreciation rather than dread. What he saw in those 2 analysts, the flinch, the recalibration, the careful rerouting of their path to avoid passing his door, was not respect. It was the practiced behavior of people who had learned, over years, to make themselves small in his vicinity. He had built an empire. And apparently, he had done it on fear so consistent that people had simply incorporated it into their daily movement, like navigating around a piece of furniture. The thought sat in his chest, heavy and indigestible, long after the analysts had disappeared down the far stairwell rather than walk past his door. The ghost cargo came to his attention on a Wednesday. He found it the way he found most things now, by moving through the parts of the company that no one thought to watch carefully anymore. Logistics records. Transit manifests. The mundane arterial system of a corporation that everyone above floor 30 considered beneath their attention. He had been cross-referencing shipping routes, old habit, the kind built over a decade of running a syndicate that lived and died by the efficiency of its movement when the pattern surfaced. A secondary manifest attached to a legitimate freight route. Container weights that didn't match their declared contents by a margin too consistent to be clerical error. Routing through a port checkpoint he recognized immediately, because he had personally negotiated its oversight arrangements 7 years ago. Someone was using his old infrastructure. His roads, his checkpoints, his inherited network of deliberate blind spots, and they were doing it without him. Worse, they were doing it through his legitimate company, which meant that if anyone looked closely enough, the trail led directly back to Moon-Yun Holdings. Back to Sui's name on the ownership documents. He sat with the manifest printout for a long time, in his second-floor office with its atrium view and its thin walls. The sales team had gone home. The building had gone quiet. And Moon-Yun, former king, current subordinate, made the first decision that had nothing to do with his own position or his own survival. He picked up the phone and called Sui's direct line. She answered on the second ring, which told him she hadn't been sleeping either. "We have a problem," he said. "And it's mine to fix." He had not intended to tell her everything that night. He had planned a controlled disclosure, enough information to justify the investigation he needed to run, carefully framed to minimize the evidence of how deep his past actually went. The version of honesty that still protected him. What he had not accounted for was the safe room. The security breach happened at 11:40 p.m., 3 days after his ghost cargo discovery. An unauthorized access event on the building's server level, sophisticated, surgical, the kind of intrusion that announced itself only in the half-second delay of a camera feed stuttering on floor 38. Yun caught it because he was still in the building, still cross-referencing manifests, still operating on syndicate hours even in a corporate body. He moved before the automated lockdown triggered. Straight to Sui's temporary office on the executive floor, where she was still at her desk, because of course she was, and he came through her door with his jacket off and his voice at the flat, actionless register he used when the situation required immediate compliance. "Safe room. Now. Don't ask." She didn't ask. The safe room was behind the executive boardroom, a relic of a security upgrade he had installed 4 years ago after a rival syndicate made a particular threat he had taken seriously. Reinforced walls, independent air supply, a communication system that ran on a separate encrypted line. He had never actually used it. He locked the door at 11:43 p.m. The building's automated security response engaged 30 seconds later, filling the corridors outside with the controlled chaos of trained personnel following protocols he had written himself. Inside, it was very quiet. Sui sat on the single bench along the far wall, her portfolio still in her hands by reflex. She looked at the room, at the quality of its construction, at the very specific way it had been designed, and then she looked at him. You built this, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Because you needed it. Yes. She set the portfolio down slowly. Jan, what exactly was our marriage protecting me from? And there it was. The question she had asked him, in different forms, throughout the entire 4 years of their marriage. The question he had deflected with efficiency, with affection deployed at strategic intervals, with the quiet and persistent argument that his world and her world could coexist as long as they stayed in separate rooms. He sat down on the floor, his back against the door, not because there was nowhere else to sit, but because the ground felt appropriate, and he told her. Not the controlled disclosure. The actual one. The ghost cargo routes and what they had originally carried. The checkpoint arrangements and what they had cost. The precise reason Clause 14b had been triggered and what transaction it had flagged and why that transaction existed in the first place. All of it. The architecture of his empire laid out in the clean, quiet language of a man who had finally stopped finding reasons to protect himself from his own history. She listened without interrupting. That had always been one of the things about her that destabilized him. Her capacity to absorb difficult information without performing a reaction. She processed. She weighed. She arrived at conclusions through a route that was entirely her own. When he finished, the silence lasted long enough that he could hear the muffled movement of security personnel 3 floors below. The divorce, she said finally. It wasn't because you didn't love me. No, he said. It was because you thought love wasn't a sufficient structure. That I needed to be somewhere the architecture couldn't reach me. He didn't answer. Which was its own kind of answer. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the reinforced concrete he had specifically selected, years ago, for a scenario he had hoped would never come. Then she looked back at him with that expression. Sadness under resolve. The surgeon. Then we have a lot to rebuild, she said. And this time, I'm the one who decides what the structure looks like. He met her eyes across the small, sealed room. Outside, Seoul's rain moved against the building in long, cold sheets. Somewhere below them, his old world was reaching its fingers through the infrastructure he had built and pulling at the foundations of the one she was trying to create. And Moon Yun, for the first time in 11 years, did not calculate his next move. He simply nodded. And meant it. The name came to him at 3 a.m., the way the most dangerous truths always do, not as a revelation, but as the quiet arrival of something he had already known and refused to look at directly. Baek Joon-ho. His right hand for 9 years. The man who had been in the room for every critical decision, every syndicate negotiation, every corporate maneuver that sat in the grey space between legal and something else entirely. Joon-ho, who had wept at Yun's wedding and stood at the back of the courthouse on the day of the divorce with the carefully neutral expression of a man processing private grief. Yun had attributed that expression to loyalty. He understood now, cross-referencing the ghost cargo access logs against the building's internal communication records, that it had been something closer to management. Joon-ho had not been grieving. He had been calculating, the way all men of that world calculated, how to position himself most advantageously inside the shifting geography of Yun's diminishment. The access pattern was clean, which was how Yun had missed it for so long. Joon-ho hadn't extracted information clumsily. He had simply been present, consistently, at the precise moments when critical decisions were made, and had ensured that certain pieces of those decisions found their way to a rival syndicate operating out of Busan. Small things, individually. Collectively, a 9-year map of everything Yun had built and exactly how it could be dismantled. Yun printed the logs, stacked them neatly, and put them in a folder. He did not call security. He did not send a message. He sat in his second-floor office with the atrium view and thought about 9 years of shared meals, shared danger, shared silences that he had mistaken for trust. Then he took the folder to Sui. She was already in her office, which no longer surprised him. In the 6 weeks since the safe room, they had developed a rhythm that neither of them had formally acknowledged, an unspoken understanding that the hours between midnight and dawn were when the real work happened, and that the real work required both of them. She read the logs without speaking. When she finished, she set the folder down with a precision that told him she was controlling something. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since 3 a.m. She looked at him. "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. A week. Maybe 10 days. I needed to be certain before I brought it to you. She absorbed this. The thing he was learning about Han Sui, the thing he had failed to learn during 4 years of marriage because he had been too occupied with managing her proximity to his world, was that she did not react to difficult information. She integrated it. Fitted it into the larger picture she was perpetually constructing, adjusted the architecture accordingly, and moved forward. There's something else, she said. She opened her desk drawer and placed a second folder in front of him. Financial records, he realized immediately. The kind of granular account movement that lived several layers beneath the quarterly reports, the capillary system of a corporation, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And someone had been looking. For months, a structured withdrawal pattern had been bleeding the company's discretionary reserves through a sequence of shell accounts, each transaction small enough to avoid automated flags, collectively large enough to have extracted 890 million Korean wons from the company's operational cushion. Attached to the last page was a communication. Anonymous, routed through 3 proxy servers. But the language was precise in the way that legal threats always are when the sender knows the evidence is real. They knew about the Incheon transaction. The one from 6 years ago that Yun had considered permanently buried. They had documentation. And they wanted 3 billion Korean wons in continued silence, or they would deliver everything they had to the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit with a bow on it. Not just Yun's name. Sui's company. Her ownership, her board, her carefully constructed legitimate future. All of it exposed to the contamination of his past. Yun read the communication twice. Set it down. How long, he said, have you been managing this alone? 11 weeks, she said. Quietly. Without accusation. He looked at her across the desk. This woman who had taken ownership of a company under siege, absorbed a blackmail scheme into her operational planning, and continued showing up every morning in her cream blazer and her minimal gold jewelry as though the ground beneath her feet was solid, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with strategy. You should have told me, he said. You were still deciding, she said simply, whether you were actually here. He didn't argue. Because she was right, and he had run out of reasons to defend positions that no longer served either of them. Tell me everything, he said. All of it. And then let me work. He set the trap the way he used to set traps, with one fundamental difference: every tool he used was legal. It took him 4 days. 4 days of working with the company's licensed surveillance team, a forensic accounting firm Sui brought in from Singapore, and a corporate attorney who had the specific and valuable quality of being entirely comfortable operating in the space where the legitimate world and the other world shared a border. The architecture of it was familiar: misdirection, controlled information release, the careful engineering of a situation where the target believed they were advancing while actually walking into a closing corridor. What was different was the sensation of doing it without the particular freedom that came from operating outside the law's geometry. Every decision required consultation. Every surveillance measure required documented authorization. Every piece of evidence needed a chain of custody that would hold in a courtroom. It was, Yun discovered, significantly harder than what he was used to, and considerably more satisfying in a way he did not immediately have language for. Junho was the key. Not as a target, as a conduit. Yun did not confront him. Instead, he fed him something, a carefully constructed piece of misinformation about a financial transfer that would be irresistible to the blackmailers, routed through a channel Junho had been using to communicate with Busan. The forensic team monitored the response in real time. The blackmailers moved on the information within 18 hours. By the time they did, every transaction they initiated was being recorded by 3 separate legal instruments. The corporate attorney filed the evidence package with the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit on a Thursday morning, 2 hours before the blackmailer's next payment deadline. The FCIU executed warrants by Friday afternoon. Yun watched the notification come through on his phone in his second-floor office and felt something he could only describe as quiet. Not triumph. Not the cold satisfaction of a syndicate victory. Something smaller and more durable than either of those things. He texted Sui 2 words, "It's done." She replied with 3, "I know." Dinner. The gala was Sui's idea, and he had argued against it. A charity event. she said. The company's annual foundation dinner, which had been quietly cancelled for the past 2 years under the weight of everything the company had been carrying. Reinstating it was a signal, to the board, to the investors, to the legitimate world, that Moonyon Holdings had stabilized. That its new owner had brought it back from the edge. Yun understood the logic and disliked the exposure. Old instincts. He had spent a decade ensuring that the people who wanted to reach him had to navigate significant obstacles to do so. A gala was an environment where those obstacles were eliminated by design. He attended. Because she asked, and because he was learning, slowly and with considerable friction, that her judgment about the legitimate world was better than his. He stayed close to her periphery the entire evening, not visibly, not in a way that read as protection. He moved through the room in the old way, the way that looked like socializing but was actually constant environmental assessment. Tracking exits. Reading posture. Cataloguing the 24 people in the room whose presence required monitoring against the 40 who were simply wealthy and harmless. He registered the threat at 9:47 p.m. A catering staff member who had been in the same corner of the room for 22 minutes without serving anyone. Whose right hand had the specific stillness of someone carrying something under a jacket. Whose eyes were not on the guests but on a single point across the room. On Sui. Yun was already moving before the calculation completed. Across the room in the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man heading somewhere with purpose, drawing no attention, creating no alarm, until he was positioned between Sui and the corner, close enough to her that when he spoke it registered only as a private conversation. "We need to move to the left," he said quietly. "Now. Keep talking." She didn't look at him. She continued her conversation with the foundation director, turned naturally to her left, and let him guide her toward the cluster of board members near the east wall while the room continued its comfortable noise around them. The man in the corner made his move 30 seconds later. By then, building security, alerted by Yun's earpiece signal 2 minutes prior, was already in position. The arrest happened in a side corridor, efficiently and without contaminating the event. Most of the room never registered the interruption. Afterward, when the gala had concluded and the last guests had filed out into the cold Seoul night, Sui found him standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the venue's upper level, looking out at the city the way he used to look out from the 43rd floor. She stood beside him. Not close enough to touch. Close enough that the choice was available. "You knew before security did," she said. "Yes. Is that always going to be true? That you see things the rest of us don't?" He considered this honestly. "Probably." She nodded slowly, looking at the city. "Then I suppose that's useful." It was not a declaration. It was something more practical than that, an acknowledgement, from a woman who dealt in accurate assessments, that what he was had value in a context that was trying to become something better. That his particular darkness, properly directed, could function as a kind of protection rather than a source of damage. He found he had nothing to add to it. Which was, he was discovering, sometimes the right response. The board meeting was 3 weeks later. Routine agenda. Quarterly review, operational updates, the formal ratification of several structural changes Sui had been implementing since taking ownership. Yun sat at the far end of the table in his current capacity, Director of Security and Special Operations, and presented his division's report in 12 minutes with the efficiency of a man who had learned to respect other people's time. At the end of the meeting, the board's senior counsel raised the question Yun had been expecting since October. Given the resolution of the blackmail case, given the demonstrated stability of the new ownership structure, given, the counsel chose his words with visible care, the changed circumstances of the past several months, would Mr. Moon be pursuing any legal avenue to recover his original shareholding? The room held itself very still. Yun had prepared an answer. Had spent, if he was honest, considerable time preparing an answer that would satisfy everyone's expectations. A diplomatic non-answer, or a qualified yes, or a carefully worded indication that the question remained open. What came out was not that. "No," he said. The room processed this. "The company is where it should be," he continued, in the flat, precise register that the board had learned, over months, to recognize as his version of sincerity. "My shares aren't the point. The point is whether this place survives the next 5 years without burning itself down. I'm more useful focused on that than on recovering something I didn't protect well enough to keep in the first place. He did not look at Sui when he said it. He didn't need to. He could feel, from the far end of the table, the quality of her attention, the particular stillness of a woman recalibrating something internal. The council made a note. The meeting concluded. The board filed out with the slightly dazed efficiency of people who had witnessed something they weren't entirely sure how to categorize. Sui stayed. When the room was empty, she remained at her end of the table and he at his, the long expanse of polished mahogany between them carrying the weight of everything they had moved through, the safe room and the sleeper clause, the ghost cargo and the blackmail scheme, the gala and the 9 years of a right hand that had been a wrong one, and 4 years of a marriage that had been a fortress instead of a home. You meant that, she said. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her portfolio, walked the length of the table, and set it down in the empty chair beside him. Not across from him, not at a managed distance, but beside him, in the way of someone who has decided, with full information and clear eyes, to occupy the same side. Then we have work to do, she said. Outside, Seoul moved through its ordinary evening. 43 floors above the street, his name was still lit in white letters on the building's face. Moon-Yun Holdings, belonging now to her, technically. Belonging, in the way that actually mattered, to whatever they were in the process of building. He opened the quarterly file. She uncapped her pen. And the city, indifferent and luminous and endlessly moving, carried on below them, unaware that somewhere in its architecture, a man who had only ever known how to take things had quietly, finally, learned how to stay. Here are some YouTube outro options for your story. Pick the vibe that fits best. And that is where we leave Moon-Yun and Han Sui. Not at a victory. Not at a wedding. But at a desk, side by side, choosing each other in the most ordinary and extraordinary way possible, through the work. If this story moved something in you, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to every single one of you, just to know how far our story has traveled. See you in the next chapter.